The path is more of a crease in the grass than a proper track, worn down over many seasons by nothing heavier than your own boots and the occasional soft tread of a badger. You follow it slowly, your steps making hardly any sound because the ground is padded with moss and old leaf litter that has lain there since the previous autumn. On both sides, the trunks of silver birch rise straight and slender, their bark catching the earliest hints of morning and glowing faintly against the darker shapes of the undergrowth. There is no wind, only a stillness so complete that you can hear the tiny rustle of a beetle moving through dry grass and the distant, drowsy call of a tawny owl settling into its daytime roost. Everything around you is familiar in the way that only a place you have known all your life can be familiar. The leaning stump halfway down the slope, the cluster of hazel shrubs with their leaves just beginning to yellow, the patch of bare chalk that shows white where the soil has slipped away after a heavy rain. You walk at an even pace, neither hurrying nor loitering, and as you go, the sky above the treetops slowly begins to change. The grey thins further, replaced by a pale wash of lemon and rose that spreads upward from the line of the eastern ridge. The light comes so gradually that you cannot pinpoint the moment when you stop being able to see the stars. They simply cease to be there, absorbed into the growing brightness, the way a few drops of water are absorbed into dry cloth. Somewhere to your left, a wood pigeon stirs in the high branches, and you hear the soft clatter of its wings as it shifts its weight before settling again. Farther down the slope, a blackbird lets out a single exploratory note, then falls silent, as if waiting for an answer that does not come. The path begins to climb gently now, curving around the shoulder of the hill where the trees thin out, and you can look across to the next ridge, a long, undulating line of woodland and open chalk downland that runs from northeast to southwest like a green wave, frozen in place. In the half-light, the landscape appears flattened without its usual depth, so that the farthest hills seem to be painted onto the sky rather than standing at a distance. A thin mist lies in the bottom of the valley, a narrow band of white that follows the course of a stream you cannot see, but whose presence you know by the line of alders and willows that marks its banks. The mist shifts slightly as you watch, breaking into soft coils that drift apart and then come together again, and the movement is so gentle that it feels like the whole valley is breathing in its sleep. You pause here for a little while, not out of tiredness but because this is a part of the morning walk that has become a quiet habit over the years. There is a flat stone at the edge of the path, half covered with grey-green lichen, and you sit on it, with your back resting against the trunk of an old birch that leans a little downhill, its bark peeling in thin, papery curls. From this spot you can see the cottage below, small and dark against the pale grass of the clearing, its thatched roof still damp with dew in its chimney, sending up a thin wisp of smoke from the banked fire you left inside. The cottage looks as if it has grown out of the hillside itself, its walls made of local flint and chalk rubble, patched with daub, its roof a deep brown that blends into the shadows of the surrounding trees. Beside the door, leaning against the wall in a tidy row, stand the handles cut from hazel shoots, each one straight and smooth and waiting. A wooden trough sits under the eave, and next to it the binding frame rests upside down to keep the rain off, its two upright posts pointing toward the sky like the legs of a sleeping animal. The light strengthens, and now you can see the details of the clearing more clearly. The grass around the cottage is short and tufted, nibbled by rabbits that you sometimes see in the late afternoon, their white tails bobbing as they scatter into the undergrowth. A pile of birch twigs, gathered the previous day, lies under a scrap of old canvas held down by stones at the corners. The well behind the cottage, a simple wooden cover over a stone-lined shaft, catches the first direct rays of the sun, and the water bucket hanging from its rope gleams for a moment before the light shifts again. Everything is in its place, just as it was when you went to bed the night before, and just as it will be tomorrow morning when you step outside once more. You rise from the stone after a while, not because any clock tells you to, but because the light has reached that particular stage where the mist begins to lift and the birds become more active. The walk back down to the cottage is easier than the walk up, the path sloping gently and your feet finding the familiar footholds without any thought. As you descend, the sounds of the wood grow busier. A robin sings a few phrases from a holly bush, a jay rasps somewhere deeper among the oaks, and off to your right you hear the soft drumming of a great spotted woodpecker working on a dead branch. The noises do not disturb the quiet. They are part of it, woven into the fabric of the morning, the way threads are woven into a length of homespun cloth. When you reach the clearing, the dew on the grass soaks the toes of your boots, and you feel the cool dampness through the leather. You stop beside the pile of birch twigs and lift the canvas to check that none have been disturbed by the night's moisture, running your palm over the smooth, silvery surfaces and finding them dry and firm. Satisfied, you replace the cover and walk the few steps to the cottage door, which stands open as it does through all the mild months of the year. Inside, the single room is still dim, lit only by the small window with its waxed linen pane and the orange glow from the hearth. The fire has burned down to a bed of red embers, and you add a few small sticks of beech wood. Not enough to build a roaring blaze, but just sufficient to keep the warmth steady against the morning chill. The interior of the cottage is arranged with a simplicity that comes from needing very little. A narrow bed of straw covered with a woolen blanket stands against one wall, its wooden frame rubbed smooth at the corners. A plain table of elm boards, darkened with age and use, holds a brown earthenware jug and a lump of yesterday's bread wrapped in a cloth. The floor is beaten earth, swept clean, and scattered with fresh rushes that release a faint green scent when you walk on them. On a shelf above the hearth sit a few small objects, a bone-handled knife, a ball of twine, a lump of beeswax, a wooden spoon worn thin at the edge. Nothing is surplus, nothing is without purpose. You take the bread from the table and break off a piece, eating it slowly while standing at the open doorway and looking out at the clearing. The bread is coarse and slightly sour, made from rye flour ground at the mill down in the valley, and you chew it without hurry, letting the morning settle fully into your bones. When you have finished eating, you step outside again and walk to the well, lifting the wooden cover and lowering the bucket on its rope until you hear the soft splash of water meeting wood. You draw the bucket back up hand over hand, the rope passing smoothly through the iron ring at the top of the frame, and pour some of the cold water into a small basin that sits on a bench by the wall. You wash your face and hands, the chill of the water tightening your skin and clearing the last traces of sleep from your eyes. Now the day's work can begin, but there is no sense of urgency, no need to rush. The brooms will be made in their own time, at the pace that your hands know best. You walk to the side of the cottage where the binding frame waits, and you set it upright, fitting the crossbar into the notches at the top of the two posts and tapping it gently with the heel of your hand until it sits level. The wood of the frame is beech, pale and close-grained, polished to a soft sheen by the countless hours of use. You run your fingers along the crossbar, feeling the slight depressions where the withies have pulled against it over the years, and you find the surface smooth and free of any splinters. Beside the frame stands a wooden bucket containing the withies that you cut yesterday from the willow copse by the stream, long withy rods of a greenish-brown color, each one as thick as your little finger and as flexible as a length of cord. They have been soaking in water all night, and now they are soft and pliable, ready to be twisted and knotted without cracking. You lift one out and hold it up, letting the excess water drip back into the bucket, and test its give between your hands. It bends easily into a loop, and when you release it, the withy springs back only a little, retaining the shape you gave it. This is exactly as it should be, and you place it back in the water with the others, ready for when you need them later. The pile of birch twigs sits under its canvas cover, and you draw the canvas aside, revealing the bundles you tied at the end of the previous day. You select one bundle and carry it to the low stool that you place near the frame. Then you sit down with the bundle across your knees. The twigs are all of a similar thickness, no wider than your finger at the base and tapering to a fine, flexible point, and they have been sorted already so that only the straightest and strongest remain. You pick up a single twig and roll it between your thumb and forefinger, feeling the slight roughness of the bark, the tiny nobles where leaves once grew, the springy resistance that tells you the wood is alive and will hold its shape through years of sweeping. The sun is higher now, spilling over the tops of the trees and casting long slanted shadows across the clearing. The air has lost its early chill and become mild, the kind of autumn warmth that seems to carry the memory of summer. A light breeze stirs the leaves of the nearest birch, making them tremble without breaking loose, and the sound is a soft shushing that blends with the occasional call of the wood pigeon, a low coo-coo-coo that repeats at long intervals and then fades away. You sit in this quiet with the birch twigs in your hands, and all around you the morning continues its slow unfolding, asking nothing more than your steady presence and the simple, patient work that will fill the hours ahead. The bread and mortar have settled in you like a small, quiet weight, enough to carry you through the morning without any thought of hunger. You stand for a moment at the doorway of the cottage, letting your eyes adjust to the full daylight that now fills the clearing. Then you turn back inside just long enough to take a length of hempen cord from the hook by the hearth and slip the small curved knife into the pocket of your rough woolen coat. The cord is about the length of your outstretched arms, twisted from fibers that still carry a faint earthy smell from the retting pond, and you coil it loosely around your hand before stepping out again into the sun. The walk to the birch grove takes you away from the cottage in a direction that you have taken so many times that the path lives in your feet rather than in your mind. You pass the well, its wooden cover now dry in the morning warmth, and cross a small patch of rough grass where a few late wildflowers still hold onto their petals, ragged pink campions, and the last of the yellow hawkbits nodding on thin stems. A brown butterfly lifts from the grass as you approach, flutters in a small circle, and settles again almost in the same spot, its wings opening and closing once before it becomes still. You step around it without breaking your stride. The ground begins to slope upward very gently, and the trees grow thicker as you leave the open clearing behind. The birches here stand closer together, their white trunks catching the light in vertical stripes that seem to shift as you walk among them, the way a fence seems to move when seen from a passing cart. The undergrowth is thinner under the birch canopy than it is in the oak woods lower down, because birch roots spread wide and shallow, drinking up so much moisture that few other plants can compete. What grows here is mostly soft grass and the occasional plump of bracken, its fronds turning from green to rust as the season advances. Your boots make a faint swishing sound through the grass, and occasionally you step on a fallen twig that snaps with a small dry crack, the sound absorbed instantly by the moss and leaves. You stop in a part of the grove that you know well, a slight hollow between three older birches whose trunks fork low to the ground, giving them the look of great pale candelabra. The light here falls in patches, some spots brightly lit, others in dappled shade that moves very slightly as the breeze stirs the upper branches. This is where the best twigs for brooms always seem to grow, perhaps because the shelter of the hollow makes the young shoots reach up straight and true in their first years. You've been cutting twigs in this same hollow for more seasons than you care to count, and it never runs short. The birch is putting up new growth each spring with a quiet determination that asks for nothing in return. You kneel on the ground first, not in any ritual way, but simply because it is the most comfortable position for the work ahead, and you lay the coil of hempen cord on the grass beside your right knee, where it will be easy to reach. The knife comes out of your pocket, a simple tool with a blade no longer than your palm, its bone handle yellowed and smoothed by the sweat and friction of your hand, its edge kept sharp on a piece of sandstone that sits on the cottage doorstep. You test the blade lightly against your thumb, not hard enough to cut, just enough to feel the slight catch of the edge, and then you turn your attention to the birches around you. Selecting the right twigs is a process that has become so automatic that you hardly think about it. Yet every choice is made with the same care that a miller uses when testing grain between his fingers. You look for twigs that are about the thickness of a goose quill at the base, sometimes a little thicker if the broom is to be a heavy one for a stable or a yard, sometimes a little thinner if it is destined for a house where the floors are smooth boards rather than stone flags. The length should be roughly that of your forearm, long enough to make a generous sweeping head, but not so long that the bristles will flop and drag. Above all, the twig must be straight, or at least straight enough, that when it is bound tightly with a dozen others, any slight curve will be pressed out by the tension of the withies. You take hold of a likely shoot, one that grows low on the trunk of the nearest birch, and you run it gently between your thumb and forefinger from base to tip. The bark is smooth and silvery, marked with the fine horizontal lines that are the birch's signature, and under your touch the twig gives a little, and then springs back, showing that the sap still moves inside it, that the wood is alive and resilient. You bend it slightly, watching how it curves evenly without flattening at any point, then release it and nod to yourself. This one is good. The knife makes a clean cut, slicing upward at a shallow angle so that the twig comes away with a sloping end rather than a flat stump. Cutting upward rather than down helps the rain run off the cut and protects the parent tree from rot. A small piece of knowledge that was passed to you so long ago that you can no longer remember learning it. The twig comes free with a soft snick, and you lay it on the grass beside the coil of cord, its silvery surface catching a gleam of sun before the light shifts again. You move to the next shoot, and then the next, working around the hollow in a slow circuit. Some twigs you reject after a brief inspection. One has a knot halfway along its length that would make a weak point in the bristles. Another has been nibbled by a caterpillar and shows a rough scar where the bark has healed over. A third is curved too sharply near the base and would never bind straight no matter how much pressure was applied. These you leave on the tree, and the knife stays in your hand without moving. The rejected twigs will continue to grow, perhaps straightening themselves by the following spring, or they will serve as perches for the wood pigeons and the finches that flit through the grove. Nothing is wasted, nothing is truly discarded. The pile of cut twigs on the grass grows very slowly, one piece added at a time, and you work at an unhurried pace that matches the rhythm of the wood around you. A wren hops onto a fallen log nearby, bobs its small brown body up and down several times as if performing a tiny dance, and then flies off into the undergrowth without making a sound. Farther away, somewhere beyond the hollow, you hear the soft tapping of a nuthatch working its way down a trunk head first, a bird that always sounds busier than it really is. The breeze stirs the birch leaves overhead, making a sound like the distant sea, though you have never seen the sea and know it only from the descriptions of a peddler who passed through the village one autumn many years ago. As the morning moves forward, you settle deeper into the work, finding a steady rhythm that carries you from tree to tree without any sense of effort. You cut a twig, examine it, place it on the pile and move to the next, and the spaces between each action are filled with a calm attention that leaves no room for stray thoughts or worries. Your hands know exactly how hard to grip the knife, exactly how much pressure to apply to the cut, exactly the angle at which to pull the twig free. Sometimes you pause to wipe the blade on the leg of your breeches, removing the thin film of sap that accumulates, and then you continue as before. The sun climbs higher, and the shadows in the hollow shorten and then shift, so that a patch of grass that was in shade when you began is now bright with light, the few drops of dew still clinging to its blades, shining like tiny glass beads. The earworms very slightly, carrying the dusty green scent of bracken and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. You shrug off your coat after a while, folding it once and laying it across a low branch where it will stay clean, and work on in your shirt sleeves, the linen soft and worn against your skin. The pile of twigs has grown large enough now that it is time to think about bundling them for the walk back to the cottage. You set the knife down on your folded coat and pick up the hempen cord, shaking out its coils until it lies straight on the grass. Then you gather the twigs together, picking them up carefully so that none of the thin tips snap, and arrange them into a neat sheaf with all the thick ends pointing the same way. The sheaf is about as big around as both your hands can encircle, and you hold it together while you take one end of the cord and begin to wind it around the bundle. Tying the bundle is a skill that requires a certain trick of the fingers, one that you mastered long ago. You wrap the cord twice around the thick end of the bundle, pull it snug, but not so tight that it crushes the bark, then pass the loose end under the wraps and pull it through to make a simple knot that will hold secure but can be undone with a single tug when you are back at the cottage. You test the bundle by lifting it and giving it a gentle shake. None of the twigs slip, and the sheaf holds together as one solid piece. Satisfied, you set it aside and begin gathering more twigs for a second bundle, because the work of the afternoon will require more than one sheaf's worth, and it is better to make the trip once than to come back again later. The second bundle fills more quickly than the first, perhaps because your hands are fully warm to the task now, or perhaps because you have found a particularly good cluster of shoots on an old birch that leans over the hollow from the eastern side. These twigs are almost perfectly uniform, as if the tree had set out to grow exactly what you needed, and you take quiet pleasure in the ease with which they come away from the branch. When you have enough, you tie this bundle too and set it beside the first, the two sheaves lying side by side on the grass like sleeping fish. You straighten up from your kneeling position, feeling the pleasant stretch in your lower back and the backs of your thighs, and you look around the hollow one more time to make sure you have not left the knife or the remaining cord behind. The knife is on your coat, the cord is now bound around the bundles, and the hollow looks much as it did when you arrived, the cut twigs having been taken so discreetly that the trees show almost no sign of the harvest. A scatter of small leaves has fallen onto the grass while you worked, shaken loose by the breeze or by the slight disturbance of your moving among the branches, and these will blend into the leaf litter by evening and become part of the soil by spring. You pick up your coat and put it back on, not because the day has grown cold, but because the walk back to the cottage passes through a patch of gorse whose sharp spines can catch on bare arms. Then you lift the two bundles, one tucked under each arm, and begin the walk home. The bundles are not heavy, only a little awkward because of their length, and you carry them with the ease of someone who has done this many times before, shifting them slightly now and then to keep the twig tips from dragging on the ground. The path back is the same path you walked in the dimness of dawn, but it looks different now, the light having strengthened and changed its angle so that the trees cast clear shadows on the grass and the moss glows a richer green. You notice a spider's web strung between two hazel stems, its silk catching the sun and holding a row of tiny dew droplets that have somehow survived the morning, each one containing a miniature reflection of the leaves above. You step around it carefully, leaving it intact, and continue on. As you descend the gentle slope toward the cottage, the sound of the wood pigeon reaches you again, the same soft five-note call that you heard earlier, though whether it is the same bird or another you cannot tell. The call is answered from somewhere to the south, a lower and slightly longer coo that fades into the rustle of the leaves, and then the wood falls silent except for the steady sound of your boots on the earth. The cottage comes into view through the trees, its thatch a warm brown against the green of the clearing, and the thin line of smoke from the chimney shows that the fire you banked this morning is still alive, waiting to be fed when you return. You reach the clearing and carry the two bundles to the open ground beside the cottage, where you lay them gently on the grass near the canvas that covers the twigs you gathered yesterday. The canvas is still in place, its stone weights undisturbed, and you lift one corner to make sure the older twigs have not become damp or moldy overnight. They are dry and clean, smelling faintly of the forest floor, and you replace the cover with care before turning your attention to the new bundles. You untie the hempen cords, coiling them again for future use, and spread the fresh twigs out in a single layer so that they can breathe and lose any surface moisture before you bind them. The silvery bark catches the midday light, and for a moment the whole pile gleams as if it were made of polished metal rather than wood. You stand back and look at the results of the morning's work, the neat row of twigs laid out and ready for the next stage, and you feel a quiet satisfaction that is too mild to be called happiness and too deep to be called habit. It is simply the feeling of a job begun correctly, the first step taken in a sequence that will end, days from now, with brooms that are straight and strong and fit for their purpose. Then you turn toward the cottage to rest for a while before the afternoon's work begins, stepping through the open doorway and into the cool dimness where the embers glow softly and the bread waits on the table, wrapped in its cloth. The cottage welcomes you back with its familiar dimness, the single room holding the quiet of late morning like a cup holds water. You step inside and pause just long enough to let your eyes adjust from the brightness of the clearing, and in that brief pause you feel the cool air settle against your face and hands. A relief after the gentle warmth of the sun on the hillside. The fire in the hearth has burned down to a bed of glowing coals that pulse softly with a deep orange light, and you add a single beech log, not for heat, but for the companionship of the small flame that soon curls around the bark and begins to whisper. Then you take the low wooden stool from its place by the wall and carry it to the open doorway, where the light falls in a broad rectangle across the beaten earth floor. You position the stool carefully so that you will be sitting half in the sunlight and half in the shadow, a spot that gives you enough brightness for the fine work ahead without making you squint. The stool is a simple thing, made of 3 pieces of elm joined by pegs, and its seat has been hollowed slightly by the weight of your body over so many years that it now fits you exactly. You sit down and feel the wood settle under you, solid and familiar, and you let your hands rest on your knees for a moment while you consider the work that comes next. The bundles of birch twigs lie outside on the grass where you left them, the hempen cords now untied and coiled and put away. You rise once more, not because you forgot them, but because the rhythm of the day makes no demand for hurry, and you walk out into the clearing to gather the twigs in your arms. They are dry to the touch and carry the pale silvery color that birch bark holds in the first days after cutting, and as you scoot them up, a few loose leaves flutter down and catch briefly on your sleeve before falling away. You carry the armload back to the cottage and lay the twigs on the floor just inside the doorway, then return for a second armload and a third, until all the fresh cut stems from the morning's work are piled in a loose heap on the worn linen cloth that you have spread across the earth in the patch of sunlight. The cloth is a piece of old sacking, soft and frayed at the edges from long use, and it serves to keep the twigs clean and to catch any fragments of bark or loose leaves that might otherwise scatter across the floor. You smooth the cloth flat with the palm of your hand, pressing out the wrinkles until it lies as even as a tabletop, and then you begin the sorting, which is the quietest part of the broom making, and the one that asks for the least thought and the most patience. You start by taking the whole heap of twigs and separating it into smaller handfuls, lifting each cluster and letting the stems fall loosely back onto the cloth, so that they spread out and reveal themselves individually. The pile that looked uniform from a distance now shows its variety, because no two twigs grow exactly alike even when they come from the same hollow and the same trees. Some are longer than the length of your forearm, some shorter and more compact, some thin as a reed at the tip, others thicker and more rigid, and each one must be examined and placed in its proper group, so that when the time comes to bind the brooms, the heads will be even and balanced. You pick up the first twig and hold it lightly between your thumb and forefinger, running your eye along its length from the cut base to the fine point. The bark is smooth and unbroken, marked only by the small horizontal dashes that are the birch's natural pattern, and the wood beneath is springy and alive. You lay this one at the far left corner of the cloth, beginning the group of the longest stems. The next twig is shorter by perhaps the width of 2 fingers, and this one goes to a spot a little farther right, starting the group of medium lengths. The third twig is almost exactly the same length as the first, and you place it beside its companion on the left, aligning the cut ends so that they form a neat line. Your hands move steadily, almost without you willing them, and the sorting becomes a kind of slow meditation. You lift a twig, you gauge its length against the mental measure that lives in your eye. You place it with its fellows. Sometimes you compare 2 twigs directly, holding them side by side with their bases aligned on your knee, and if one is imperceptibly longer, you move it to the next group over. The differences are small, often no more than a fraction of an inch, but you know from experience that small differences matter when a dozen twigs are bound together and the bristles must meet the floor evenly, without gaps or uneven wear. The sun moves a little higher as you work, and the rectangle of light through the doorway shifts slowly across the floor, always staying just large enough to illuminate the cloth and the twigs and your busy hands. A light breeze brushes against the thatch overhead, making a soft rustling sound like a mouse moving through dry straw, and a few pale strands of the thatch are lifted very slightly and then fall back. Outside, the wood pigeon continues its low cooing at long intervals, and a bee passes the doorway with a drone that rises and falls as it circles the wildflowers by the well. You come now to the sorting by thickness, which is the second part of the work, and requires a different kind of attention. The lengths are sorted, 3 rough groups laid out across the cloth, and within each group you now turn the twigs over and run your fingers around their circumference to feel the width. A thick twig at the base will make a stiff bristle, good for the outer ring of a broom head where the most wear occurs, while a thinner twig will provide the finer, more flexible center that catches dust without scratching a polished floor. You separate each length group into 2 piles, thick and thin, and as you do so, the cloth begins to fill with orderly ranks of twigs, the way a field of wheat looks after the binder has passed through. Occasionally you find a twig that is too brittle to be of use. You discover these by bending the tip gently, and if the wood snaps with a dry crack rather than curving and springing back, you set the twig aside in a small heap by the hearth. These brittle pieces will not be wasted. They will serve as kindling for the morning fire, their thin bark catching the flame quickly and burning hot and fast. Other twigs are rejected because they have a knobby swelling, where a side shoot once grew, or because the bark is scarred and peeling in a way that suggests the wood inside might be dead. These also go to the kindling pile, and you make a mental note to gather extra twigs on the next trip to the hollow to replace the ones that have been discarded. The air inside the cottage smells of dry birch bark and old wood smoke, a combination that is so much a part of your life that you rarely notice it consciously, though it is always there in the background, the way the sound of the wind in the trees is always there. Occasionally, when you shift your position on the stool, you catch a fainter scent of the linseed oil that you use to treat the hazel handles, a nutty and slightly sharp smell that drifts from the corner where the finished handles are stacked. The smells are not mixed but layered, each one occupying its own space, and together they create the particular atmosphere of the cottage workshop, a place where nothing is artificial and everything comes from the woods and fields nearby. Your fingers have begun to work entirely on their own now, picking up twigs and placing them in their proper piles, while your mind drifts in the way that a boat drifts on a still pond, moving without any particular destination. You think of nothing in particular, or perhaps you think of everything in a way that is so diffuse that no single thought catches and holds. The wood pigeon calls, the breeze moves the thatch, your hands sort the twigs, and all these things happen together in a quiet harmony that requires no commentary and no reflection. This is the part of the work that you have always liked best, the part that feels less like labor and more like simply being present in the world. A few more twigs go to the kindling heap, and then you find one that gives you pause. It is a twig of ordinary length and thickness, but near its tip there is a slight curve, a gentle bend that you had not noticed when you were cutting in the hollow. You hold it up to the light and rotate it slowly, examining the curve from different angles. A mild bend is not a defect. Many brooms are made with twigs that have a slight natural arc, and when they are bound together, the curves often cancel each other out, or give the finished head a pleasing fullness. You decide that this twig can stay, and you place it in the thick group of the long stems, where its curve will be pressed straighter by the tension of the binding. You continue sorting, and as the piles grow more defined, you begin to see the future brooms taking shape in your mind. The long, thick twigs will form the sturdy yard brooms built to sweep the cobbles of a coaching inn or the flags of a dairy. The medium lengths of medium thickness will become the house brooms, balanced and comfortable for a maid's hand, meant for the smooth oak boards of a parlor or the tiles of a hallway. The shortest and thinnest twigs will be bound into the small hearth brooms, delicate things used for sweeping ash from around the fire without disturbing the embers. Every twig has its place, and you know without having to think about it exactly which type of broom each group will serve. The pile of sorted twigs now covers almost the entire cloth, arranged in neat parallel rows that look like the ridges of a ploughed field seen from a distance. You stand up from the stool and stretch your arms above your head, feeling the pleasant pull in your shoulders, and then you crouch down again to tidy the edges of the groups, pushing any stray twigs back into alignment with the side of your hand. The cloth is full, and the kindling heap by the hearth has grown to about the size of a small loaf, enough to start several fires on cold mornings. You take a moment to sweep the loose bits of bark and leaf from the cloth, gathering them in your cupped hand and carrying them to the hearth, where you drop them onto the kindling pile. The fragments are light as paper, and they flutter briefly before settling, and a few small pieces of silvery bark cling to your palm until you brush them off against the side of the hearthstone. Then you return to the stool and sit down again, your back resting against the doorframe, and you look out of the clearing while your hands rest idle for the first time since the sorting began. The sun is now well past its midpoint, the shadows of the trees stretching eastward across the grass, and the color of the light has deepened from the pale gold of morning to a warmer, honeyed tone that makes the thatch roof of the cottage glow, and the white trunks of the birches shine with an almost pearly brilliance. A small flock of starlings passes overhead in a loose formation, their wings making a soft whistling sound, and they settle for a moment in the top of an ash tree on the far side of the clearing, chattering and fussing before rising again and disappearing over the ridge. The well bucket hangs motionless. The breeze that brushed the thatch earlier has now stilled entirely, and the whole landscape seems to be holding its breath in the afternoon, calm, the same way you hold your breath when you are listening for a distant sound that never quite arrives. You let your gaze rest on the binding frame that stands near the cottage wall, its uprights and crossbar patient and waiting, and you know that the next stage of the work will begin soon, perhaps this evening or perhaps tomorrow morning, depending on how the light holds. But for now there is no hurry, and you allow yourself to sit for a little longer in the doorway, enjoying the quiet and the knowledge that the twigs are sorted and ready, each one in its proper place and waiting for the withies that will draw them together into something useful and whole. The sorted twigs lie in their neat rows on the linen cloth, and you leave them there for now, knowing they will come to no harm in the dry air of the cottage. Your attention turns instead to the withies, those long pliable willow shoots that have been waiting in their wooden bucket since you cut them yesterday from the copse down by the stream. You walk to the corner where the bucket stands and look down into it, seeing the greenish-brown rods lying submerged in water that has grown faintly cloudy from the tannins leaching out of the bark. The withies are still stiff enough to hold their shape when you lift one clear of the water, but you can feel that the outer skin has begun to soften, yielding slightly under the pressure of your thumb. The soaking must continue until the withies are fully pliable, able to be twisted and knotted without splitting, and you know from long experience that the water in the bucket has grown stale and cool and will benefit from being changed. You lift the bucket by its rope handle, the weight of the water pulling against your arm, and carry it outside into the afternoon sunlight. The clearing is warm and still, the shadows of the trees having stretched a little farther eastward since you last looked, and the grass under your boots is dry and springy. You walk around the side of the cottage to the well that stands in a small patch of bare earth, its wooden cover bleached grey by many seasons of sun and rain. The well is an old one, older perhaps than the cottage itself, and its stone-lined shaft goes down through the chalk to a depth that you have never measured, but which the old men of the village used to say was deeper than the height of 3 oaks stood, end to end. The wooden cover fits snugly over the stone rim, and you lift it off with both hands, setting it aside on the grass. The smell that rises from the well is cool and clean, faintly mineral, the smell of water that has filtered through centuries of chalk and emerged pure and cold at the bottom of the shaft. You lean over slightly, bracing one hand on the stone rim, and look down into the darkness, where far below you can see a tiny circle of reflected light, the sky reduced to a silver coin shimmering on the surface of the water. The rope is coiled on a wooden peg driven into the well frame, and you unwind it slowly, feeding it through the iron ring at the top of the frame and letting the bucket descend hand over hand. The rope is made of hemp, thick and slightly rough against your palms, and it moves through the iron ring with a soft creaking sound that is as much a part of the cottage as the smell of wood smoke or the call of the wood pigeon. You lower the bucket until you feel the rope go slack, meaning the bucket has reached the water and tipped on its side to fill, and then you pause for a count of 10, giving it time to sink and take in its full measure. When you draw the bucket back up, the rope pulls taut, and the weight of the water transfers through the hemp fibers into your hands and arms, a steady resistance that you have known since you were tall enough to reach the well frame. The bucket rises slowly, turning very slightly on the end of the rope, and you can hear the water sloshing softly against its wooden sides, a sound that carries a deep coolness with it. At last the bucket appears at the rim of the well, its sides glistening, and you lift it free of the iron ring and set it on the stone rim, where a few drops spill over and darken the chalk for a moment before evaporating in the warmth. You carry the fresh water back to the wooden trough that sits under the eave of the cottage, a long, shallow container made of elm boards, caulked with beeswax and pine resin, wide enough to hold a dozen withies laid side by side. The trough has been used for this same purpose for as long as you can remember, and the inside surface is stained a soft grey-green from the willow bark, the wood itself worn smooth by the countless soakings it has held. You tip the bucket and pour the water in, watching it spread across the bottom of the trough and begin to climb the sides, the surface catching the light and throwing rippling reflections onto the cottage wall. The water is so clear that you can see every knot and grain line in the elm boards at the bottom, magnified slightly by the lens of the water, the way a pebble in a stream appears larger and closer than it truly is. One bucket is not enough to fill the trough to the depth you need, so you return to the well and draw a second bucket, then a third, walking back and forth across the grass with the steady pace that marks all the work you do. By the time the third bucket has been poured in, the trough is deep enough that a withy placed inside will be completely covered, and you stop to wipe your brow with the back of your hand, the exertion of the water drawing having brought a slight warmth to your skin, despite the mildness of the day. You coil the rope back onto its peg, replace the wooden cover over the well mouth, and stand for a moment looking out across the clearing while your breathing settles back to its resting rhythm. The afternoon has continued its slow advance while you worked, and now the sun is distinctly past its highest point, beginning that long, gentle slide toward the western ridge that will end many hours from now, in the soft dusk that settles over the Chilterns like a blanket. The light has a mellowness to it that the morning lacked, a slight golden quality that makes the colors of the clearing deeper and richer, the green of the grass more saturated, the white of the birch trunks more luminous. A pair of swallows are hawking over the open ground beyond the cottage, their forked tails cutting precise shapes in the air as they chase invisible insects, and their calls are high and thin, barely audible at this distance. You turn back to the cottage and go inside to fetch the withies. The bucket of stale water still sits by the door, and you lift out the willow rods one by one, letting the water drain off before carrying them outside to the trough. The withies are about as long as your arm is from shoulder to fingertip, some a little more, and they are straight, except for a slight natural curve near the thicker end where each shoot joined the parent willow. The bark is a muted greenish-brown smooth except for the occasional small bud scar that marks where a leaf once grew, and under your handling the rods have a pleasant weight, not heavy, but substantial, the weight of something alive and ready to serve its purpose. You lay the withies into the fresh water of the trough one at a time, placing them side by side so that each rod has its own space and none of the bark is scraped or abraded by contact with its neighbors. As they settle into the water, the withies darken visibly, the dry parts of the bark absorbing moisture and deepening from a pale green-brown to a richer shade that is almost olive. Small bubbles form on the surface of the bark, tiny spheres of trapped air that cling for a moment and then detach and rise slowly to the surface, where they pop without sound. The water in the trough shivers very slightly with each new addition, concentric rings spreading outward from the point where the withy enters until they meet the wooden sides and fade away. When all the withies are in the trough, you reach down and press them gently under the surface with your palm, making sure that every part of every rod is fully submerged. A few more bubbles rise, the last of the air escaping from the fibers, and then the water settles into stillness, the withies visible through the clear lens of the water like specimens preserved in a cabinet of curiosities. You wipe your wet hand on the leg of your breeches and straighten up, your back making a small sound of protest that is gone as soon as you shift your weight. The soaking will take until tomorrow morning, perhaps longer if the willow is particularly thick, or if the night turns cold enough to slow the absorption of water into the wood. You know this from experience, and you also know that there is no way to hurry the process. The withies will soften at their own pace, the water molecules working their way into the cellulose fibers, loosening the bonds that make the dry rod stiff and brittle, and, when they are ready, they will bend like leather and twist without cracking. Patience is not a virtue in this work, it is simply the nature of the materials, something you learned to accept long ago, the way you learned to accept the turning of the seasons. You leave the trough where it is under the eave, safe from any rain that might come in the night, and shaded from the direct sun that would otherwise warm the water too quickly and encourage mold. Then you walk a few steps away to the edge of the clearing, where you can see out across the valley that lies below the cottage, a broad sweep of farmland and woodland that stretches away to the southeast until it blurs into a soft blue distance that might be the edge of the world or might be the next range of hills. The view from this spot is one that you never tire of, though you have seen it in every season and every weather for more years than you can easily count. The valley is a patchwork of small fields divided by hedgerows of hawthorn and elder, their boundaries following the contours of the land in the irregular way that marks fields that were laid out by hand rather than by surveyor. Some of the fields are pale gold with the stubble of harvested barley, others are dark brown where the plough has turned the soil for winter wheat, and a few are still green with pasture where sheep or dairy cattle are grazing, their shapes small as insects from this distance. The stream that runs along the valley bottom is invisible, hidden by a line of alders and willows whose foliage is just beginning to turn yellow at the tips, but you can trace its course by the meandering line of darker green that cuts through the center of the valley floor. Beyond the valley, the land rises again in a series of low ridges, each one paler and more indistinct than the one before, until the farthest ridge is no more than a blue-gray line drawn across the horizon, and impossible to separate from the sky. A thin haze hangs over the distant hills, a common sight in the autumn when the air is still and the moisture from the ground rises and lingers, softening the edges of the landscape and giving the whole view the quality of a watercolor painting on damp paper. Nothing moves in the valley except the occasional bird, a crow or a kite, wheeling slowly on an updraft, and the smoke from a farmhouse chimney that climbs straight up for a little way before the haze takes it and smudges it into the background. You stand looking at the view for some time, your hands at your sides and your weight balanced evenly on both feet, and the quiet of the afternoon wraps around you like a familiar garment. The work is done for now, the withies soaking in their trough, and the twigs sorted and waiting, and there is nothing that demands your immediate attention. This is the part of the day that you have come to think of as the pause between tasks, the interval that is neither work nor rest but something in between, a time when the body is still but the mind is gently alert, noticing the small changes in the light and the air, and the sounds of the wood without any need to act on them. After a while you turn back from the view and walk slowly around the cottage to the front door, running your hand absently along the rough flint at the wall as you go, feeling the napped surfaces catch slightly against your palm. The fire inside has burned down again, the single beech log having been reduced to a long white ash shape that still holds the ghost of the wood's form, and you add another log and sit down on the stool by the hearth to watch the new flame catch. The wood smoke rises to the chimney and drifts out into the afternoon sky, adding its thin column to the haze over the valley, and you breathe in the familiar scent and let the warmth settle on your face and hands. The day passes in small observances like this, the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that make up a life. You eat the rest of the bread, tearing it into pieces and chewing each one slowly, and you drink a cup of water from the bucket. You step outside to check that the canvas over the older twigs has not shifted, and you find it exactly as you left it. You walk to the edge of the clearing and listen to the wood, hearing the robin that sings its evening song from the top of a hawthorn, the same robin that will sing in the same place tomorrow at the same time. And when the light begins to turn from gold to amber and the shadows stretch all the way across the clearing to touch the trunks of the birches on the far side, you know that the day is drawing toward its close, and that the withies will soak through the night, softening in the cool water under the stars, waiting for your hands to return to them in the morning. You wake on the second morning to a light that is softer than the day before, a diffuse grey-white glow that fills the cottage through the small window and the cracks around the door. When you step outside into the clearing, you see that a high thin cloud has spread across the sky during the night, a veil so fine that the sun still shines through it, but without the sharp golden edges of yesterday. The air is cooler, too, carrying a slight dampness that is not rain, but the promise of rain somewhere farther west, and the grass is wetter than usual, with a dew that has not yet begun to lift. You stand for a moment in the doorway, your arms folded loosely across your chest, and you breathe in the morning, noting without any particular concern that the work with the binding frame will be done in the open air today, under the soft, even light that the cloud cover provides. The withies have soaked through the night, and you walk to the trough under the eave to check their progress. When you lift one of the willow rods from the water, it comes up dripping and dark, the bark now a deep olive brown that is almost black in the creases. You bend it between your hands, slowly at first, feeling the resistance give way to a pliable arc, and then you twist it gently, watching the fibers spiral without cracking or splintering. The withy is ready as it will ever be, and you return it to the trough and go to fetch the binding frame. The frame stands against the cottage wall, where you set it upright yesterday, its two beechwood posts rising to about the height of your waist and its crossbar notched securely into place at the top. You lift it by the crossbar, the wood cool and smooth under your hands, and carry it out into the center of the clearing where the light is best and where you will have room to move around it as you work. You set the frame down on a patch of level grass, pressing the bottom ends of the posts into the soft earth so that the whole structure stands firm without wobbling. Then you step back and look at it, this simple arrangement of 3 pieces of wood that has been the heart of the Broom Squire's trade for generations, and you nod to yourself, satisfied that it is steady and true. Next you bring out the withies, carrying them from the trough in a wet bundle that drips a trail of dark spots across the grass. You lay them on a piece of old sacking spread beside the frame, arranging them so that their thicker ends are all facing the same direction and none of them are tangled together. The withies gleam wetly under the cloud-filtered light, their surface is slick and reflective, and when you touch them, your fingers come away cool and faintly sticky with the willow's natural mucilage. This stickiness will help the bindings hold tight as they dry, adding to the grip that the knots themselves provide. The sorted birch twigs come out next, carried from the cottage in their groups on the linen cloth. You have decided to begin with the long, thick group, the ones destined for the sturdy yard brooms, because they are the most forgiving and will warm your hands to the rhythm of the binding before you move on to the finer work. You set the cloth down on the grass to the left of the frame, close enough that you can reach the twigs without stretching, and you kneel beside it for a moment to check that the twigs are still in their neat rows, still sorted and ready. They are exactly as you left them, pale and dry and faintly fragrant, and you rise again and take your position behind the frame. The binding frame is simple in its operation, simple enough that a child could understand it after watching for 5 minutes, and complex enough that a lifetime of practice still leaves room for small refinements. The crossbar serves as a brace against which you can pull the withy, giving you the leverage to wrap the twigs so tightly that they compress into a solid mass. The posts keep the crossbar at the right height, and the whole frame can be turned or tilted as needed, though you rarely move it once you have begun. You place your right foot against the base of the nearer post to steady it, feel the wood press back against the sole of your boot, and then you reach down and pick up the first withy from the sacking. The withy is cold and wet in your hand, and you hold it up in front of you, letting the excess water run down your wrist and drip from your elbow. The rod is about as thick as your little finger at the base and tapers gradually to a fine point at the tip, a shape that nature has designed and that your knife has only lightly modified by trimming away any side shoots. You take the thicker end and split it with your thumbnail, finding the natural line where the fibers want to separate, and you work the split down for about the length of your hand, opening a cleft that will allow you to start the binding. The split wood parts cleanly, revealing the pale inner fibers, and you twist one half of the cleft around your finger to begin turning the withy into a rough cord. This twisting is the foundation of all the binding work, and your hands perform it with the automatic ease of long practice. You hold the thicker end of the withy in your left hand and work the split section with your right, rolling it between your thumb and forefinger until the fibers begin to spiral and bind together, turning from a flat strip into something round and strong. The withy responds to the twisting by becoming slightly thinner and slightly longer, the fibers stretching and aligning themselves, and the sound it makes is a soft creaking, like a green branch bending in a light wind. When you have twisted enough to make a cord about the length of your forearm, you stop and loop the cord loosely around your left wrist to keep it from unwinding while you prepare the first bundle of twigs. You select a dozen twigs from the long, thick group, counting them out one by one as you lay them on your knee. The twigs are cool and dry, their silvery bark smooth under your fingers, and you align their thick ends with care, tapping them gently against your thigh until they form an even row. Then you gather them into a tight bundle, squeezing them together with both hands, feeling the slight give and spring of the wood as the twigs resist compression. The bundle is about the diameter of a broom handle at its thick end, and flares out at the thin end into a fan shape that will become the sweeping surface of the finished broom. Now you kneel behind the binding frame, placing the bundle of twigs across the crossbar so that the thick ends project a hand's width beyond the far side of the bar and the rest of the bundle lies along your side of the frame. You lower your body weight onto the bundle, pressing it down against the crossbar with your knee, and the twigs compress under the pressure with a soft creaking sound. The frame holds steady, its posts planted firmly in the grass, and the crossbar takes your weight without bending, the beechwood having been chosen for exactly this purpose, its grain dense and straight and resistant to flex. With the bundle pinned under your knee, you take the twisted end of the withy and pass it over the thick ends of the twigs, then under the crossbar, then up the far side, pulling it tight with a steady pressure that makes the fibers of the willow creak again. You wrap the withy around the bundle 3 times, each wrap lying snug against the one before, and the wet willow cord bites into the birch bark, compressing the twigs further until they begin to lose their individual roundness and merge into a single solid mass. The motion of wrapping is circular and continuous, your right hand moving around the bundle and the crossbar in a steady rhythm, while your left hand feeds the withy and keeps the tension even. When the 3 wraps are complete, you make the first hitch, the simple knot that locks the binding in place and prevents it from loosening as the withy dries and shrinks. You pass the loose end of the withy under the nearest wrap, pull it through until a small loop forms, then pass the end through the loop and draw it tight. The hitch settles against the wraps with a soft click, and you test it by tugging on the loose end. It holds fast, gripping the underlying cord with the friction that makes willow such a good material for this purpose. You make a second hitch beside the first, then a third, each one identical to the one before, and when you have finished, the bindings are so secure that you could lift the whole bundle by the loose end of the withy without any slippage. You ease your knee off the bundle and lift the bound end from the crossbar, examining your work. The thick ends of the twigs are now compressed into a tight round head, the birch bark showing faint indentations where the withy has pressed into it, and the bindings themselves are neat and even, each wrap parallel to the others and each hitch tucked away so that no loose ends protrude. The rest of the bundle fans out in a spray of silvery twigs that will be trimmed later into the finished bristles. You set this first broom head aside on the grass, where it will lie in the open air and begin to dry, and you reach for the next withy to start the second bundle. The morning passes in this rhythm, a cycle of gathering twigs, aligning them, pressing them down on the crossbar, and binding them with the wet willow cords. You work steadily, without any sense of hurry or delay, and as each broom head is finished, you add it to the row on the grass, a growing line of bound bundles that will soon be fitted with handles and become the brooms that will travel to London. The cloud cover overhead thickens slightly and then thins again, the sun brightening briefly before softening once more, and the temperature stays mild and even, comfortable for working in shirt sleeves. Your hands have by now fully remembered the rhythm of the binding, and they move through the steps without your conscious direction, the way a musician's hands move through a familiar tune. You gather the twigs, you align them, you press them to the bar, you wrap and hitch and set aside, and between each action there is a space of quiet attention. A moment when you notice the weight of the withy in your hand, or the texture of the birk, or the way the light falls on the grass. The work is repetitive but not monotonous, because each bundle is slightly different from the one before, the twigs varying in their exact thickness and curve, and your hands must adjust the pressure of the binding to match the character of the wood. A robin comes to watch you from the top of the well cover, its head cocked to one side, its dark eye bright and round. You see it there and continue working, neither pausing nor shooing it away, and after a while the robin flies down to the grass a few feet from the frame and pecks at something invisible in the turf, then flies off again toward the trees. A little later, a pair of wood pigeons settle in the birch nearest the cottage, their soft cooing blending with the creaking of the withies and the occasional dry rustle of falling leaves. These are the only sounds, the quiet music of the clearing on an overcast autumn morning, and they accompany your work without distracting from it. When you have bound 6 broom heads, you stop to rest your hands and rise from your kneeling position, stretching your legs and walking a slow circle around the clearing. The grass is springy underfoot, and the dew has finally dried, leaving only a faint dampness in the deeper shade under the trees. You walk to the well and drink a dipper of water, the cold liquid shocking your teeth slightly and then soothing your throat, and you pour a second dipper over the back of your neck, letting it run down your collar and cool the skin between your shoulder blades. The day is not hot, but the work of binding has kept your muscles warm, and the water feels pleasant against the warmth. You walk back to the frame and look at the row of finished broom heads, 6 of them lying in the grass with their bindings glistening wetly in the overcast light. As the withies dry, they will shrink very slightly, pulling the bindings even tighter and locking the twigs into a grip that will hold for years of sweeping, through dust and damp and the wear of countless floors. The knowledge of this is satisfying in a quiet way, the same way that the sight of a well-made hayrick or a neatly thatched roof is satisfying. You have done good work so far, and there is more to do, and that is enough. You kneel again behind the frame, pick up the next withy, and begin the next bundle. The afternoon is still ahead of you, the light holding steady under the high thin cloud, and there are many more broom heads to bind before the day is done. The row of finished broom heads lies on the grass behind you, 6 bundles of birch twigs bound tight with willow withies and left to dry in the mild overcast air. You have rested your hands and taken water from the well, and now you return to the binding frame with the quiet readiness that comes from having settled fully into the day's rhythm. The frame stands exactly where you left it, its beechwood posts still pressed firmly into the turf, its crossbar still steady in its notches, and the sacking beside it still holds several withies waiting in their wet gleam under the soft light. You kneel again on the grass, feeling the familiar slight discomfort in your knees that will fade as soon as the work absorbs your attention, and you reach for a fresh withy from the sacking. This one is slightly longer than the last, a willow rob that you cut from the lower part of the copse where the shoots grow straighter and with fewer buds, and as you lift it from the wet cloth, it trails a few drops of water that darken the grass in small spots. The bark is smooth and unbroken, the color a deep olive that is almost the color of the stream that feeds the copse, and when you bend it between your hands, the fibers give with a supple resilience that tells you this withy will bind well. You split the thick end with your thumbnail, finding the natural line of separation where the fibers want to part, and you work the split down for the length of your hand until you have a cleft that divides the rod into two even halves. The inner wood is pale and fibrous, softer than the bark, and it releases a faint green scent as you open it up, the smell of willow sap that is sweet and slightly astringent. You twist one half of the cleft between your thumb and forefinger, rolling the fibers into a cord, and the withy responds by spiraling into a tight round shape that will hold the first knot without slipping. The twisting sound is a soft crepitation, almost too quiet to hear, a sound that is more felt through your fingers than heard by your ears. You set the prepared withy aside on the crossbar of the frame, where it rests in a loose coil while you reach for the twigs. The bundle you select this time is from the medium-length group, the ones destined for house brooms, and you take 12 twigs from the row, counting them out with your fingertips the way a scribe counts sheets of paper. These twigs are slightly thinner than the ones you used for the yard brooms, their tips finer and more flexible, and their bark is a paler silver, almost white in the diffused light. You tap the thick ends against your thigh to align them, a soft drumming sound that lasts only a moment, and then you gather the bundle in both hands and squeeze it tight, feeling the slight springiness of the wood resist your pressure. Now comes the placing of the bundle on the frame, which is the step that determines the shape of the finished broom head. You lay the twigs across the crossbar with the thick ends projecting beyond the far side by a hand's width, the same as before, but this time you fan the thin ends out very slightly, spreading them so that the bundle is not a tight cylinder, but a gentle cone that will sweep more broadly across the floor. The angle of the fan is small, no more than the width of your open hand at the tip, but it is enough to make a difference in the finished broom, giving it a wider sweep without sacrificing the density of the bristles. You lower your knee onto the bundle, pressing it down against the crossbar with a steady weight that compresses the twigs and holds them in place. The beechwood bar takes your weight without a sound, its dense grain having been shaped by a craftsman long ago to bear exactly this pressure, and the twigs under your knee creak softly as the bark of each stem presses against the bark of its neighbors. The feeling of the bundle under your knee is familiar, the slight give of the wood, followed by the solid resistance that tells you the twigs are compressed as much as they need to be, the air between them driven out so that when the withy is applied, the bindings will hold without any looseness. You pick up the prepared withy from where it rests on the crossbar, taking the twisted end in your right hand and the unworked length in your left, and you pass the cord over the thick ends of the twigs, then down around the far side of the crossbar, then up again on your side, pulling it tight in a smooth motion that draws the twigs together even more firmly. The wet willow slides over the birch bark with a slight hissing sound, and you pull until the cord bites into the bundle, compressing the twigs until they begin to lose their separate shapes and become a single unit. The first wrap is now in place, lying diagonally across the bundle, and you follow it with a second wrap that lies parallel and snug against the first, the two cords forming a neat band around the compressed twigs. The wrapping continues, your right hand making a steady circular motion around the bundle and the crossbar, while your left hand feeds the withy and maintains an even tension, never letting the cord go slack, but never pulling so hard that the willow fibers might snap. The third wrap settles beside the second, and then you make a fourth, a fifth, until 6 even wraps encircle the bundle, each one lying flush against the one before with no gaps or overlaps. The bindings form a band about the width of 2 fingers, a tight collar that will hold the twigs in their conical shape and provide the anchor for the hitches that will lock the whole thing in place. Now you make the first hitch, the small locking knot that transforms the wrapped cord from a temporary binding into a permanent one. You pass the loose end of the withy under the last wrap, pulling it through until a small loop forms. Then you bring the end around and pass it through the loop, drawing it tight with a careful pressure that snugs the hitch against the underlying wraps without cutting into them. The willow cord is still wet and pliable, and it takes the shape of the hitch easily, the fibers bending rather than kinking. You make a second hitch directly beside the first, passing the end under the same wrap and pulling it through the same loop, and this second hitch locks the first in place the way a second knot secures a first knot on a ship's rigging. You pause with the loose end of the withy still in your hand, and examine the bindings, running your thumb across the wraps and the hitches to feel for any unevenness. The wraps are smooth and parallel, the hitches sit neatly against them, and the bundle of twigs is compressed into a tight round head that flares very slightly at the thin end. You find a single twig that has shifted out of alignment during the wrapping, its tip straying outward from the cone, and you pinch it between your thumb and forefinger and gently work it back into the bundle, pushing it into place until it is flush with its neighbors. The adjustment is small, barely noticeable, but it is the kind of small adjustment that makes the difference between a broom that sweeps cleanly and one that leaves a stray line of dust. The binding is nearly complete, but there is one more step before the broom head can be set aside to dry. The loose end of the withy must be tucked away so that no sharp point protrudes to catch on a hand or snag on a doorway, and this tucking is a matter of threading the end under the wraps and pulling it through until it lies flat against the bundle. You work the tip of the withy under the third wrap from the top, using your thumbnail to lift the cord just enough to create a small opening, and you push the end through, pulling it from the far side until the entire remaining length of withy has been drawn under the wraps and lies hidden against the birch bark. The tuck is invisible unless you know where to look, and it will shrink slightly as the withy dries, gripping the end even more tightly and making the binding secure against any amount of use. You lift your knee from the bundle and pick up the finished broom head, holding it in both hands and turning it over to inspect it from all sides. The thick end is now a tight cylinder of compressed birch stems, the bindings dark and wet against the silvery bark, and the thin end fans out in a spray of fine tips that will make a broad, soft, sweeping surface. The whole thing has a certain balance to it, a weight that feels right in your hands, and you set it aside on the grass with the others, laying it carefully so that the thin tips are not crushed or bent. The row of finished broom heads now numbers 7, and you wipe your hands on the sacking before reaching for the next withy. The day has continued its quiet progression while you worked, the cloud cover thinning very slightly to reveal a patch of pale blue sky off to the northwest. Though the sun remains veiled and the light stays soft and even, the air has warmed a little, enough that the dampness of the early morning is entirely gone, and a light breeze has begun to stir the birch leaves, making a sound like the pages of a book being turned very slowly. You repeat the whole sequence for the next broom head, and the next, each repetition slightly different in its details, but the same in its essentials. A new withy is split and twisted, a new bundle of twigs is gathered and aligned and pressed to the crossbar, and the wrapping and hitching and tucking are performed again with the same careful attention. The variations come from the materials themselves. One bundle has a twig that is slightly thicker than the others and requires a little extra pressure to compress. Another has a withy that is particularly supple and wraps almost too easily. A third has a fan shape that takes a moment longer to arrange to your satisfaction. These small differences are what keep the work from becoming entirely mechanical. There is always something to notice, something to adjust, something that asks for your attention. By the time you have bound 12 broom heads, the row on the grass has grown long enough that you must shift the earlier ones to make room, moving them farther from the frame and laying them side by side in a neat line that points toward the cottage door. The earliest bindings are already beginning to dry, the wet dark color of the willow fading to a lighter brown as the surface moisture evaporates into the air, and the birch twigs are recovering their silvery sheen now that the pressure of your knee has been released. The broom heads look orderly and purposeful, lying there, each one a small achievement of hand and eye and patience. You rise again from your kneeling position and walk around the clearing to ease your legs, which have grown stiff from the prolonged stillness of the binding work. The robin has returned to its perch on the well cover, and it watches you pass without flying away, its small body perfectly still, except for the occasional blink of its dark eye. You walk to the edge of the clearing where the birches thin out, and you can see down into the valley, and the view is much the same as it was yesterday. The patchwork fields and the meandering line of the stream and the blue-grey ridge on the horizon. The haze has lifted slightly, the air being drier than it was in the early morning, and the distant hills have a sharper outline. The individual trees just barely visible as tiny dots along the skyline. You stand looking at the view while your muscles relax and your breathing slows, and you think about the work still ahead, the handles that must be attached and the bristles that must be trimmed and the cart that must be loaded for the journey to London. But these thoughts are not anxious or pressing, they are simply the quiet awareness of what comes next, the same way you are aware of the seasons that follow one another in their turn. There is time enough for everything, and the work will be done when it is done. When your legs feel loose again, you return to the frame and resume your position, your knees finding the same depressions in the grass where you have been kneeling all morning. You take up the next withy and the next bundle of twigs, and the binding continues, the rhythm as steady and unhurried as the turning of the leaves on the birches, or the slow passage of the cloud shadows across the valley floor. The broom heads have been drying on the grass for some hours now, long enough that the withies have paled from their wet olive darkness to a lighter tan, and the birch twigs have firmed in their compressed shape. Each bundle now a tight solid head that will not shift or loosen. You gather them from the row where they have been lying, picking them up two at a time and carrying them into the cottage, where you stack them against the wall near the hearth, so that the lingering warmth of the fire can finish the drying. The stack makes a neat pile of flared cones, their silvery tips catching the orange glow of the embers, and you pat the topmost one lightly with your palm before turning away to the next part of the work. The handles lean in the corner beside the chimney, a dozen hazel rods that you cut last winter from the coppice on the north side of the hill and have been seasoning ever since. You take one down and hold it across your body, running your eye along its length to check that it is still straight and true. The hazel is a pale wood, almost white when first stripped of its bark, but these handles have been rubbed with linseed oil over many weeks and have taken on a warm honey color that glows softly in the dim light. The surface under your palm is smooth as polished bone, the oil having filled the tiny pores of the wood and hardened into a skin that is both protective and pleasant to the touch. You test the weight of the handle, balancing it on your open hand the way you would balance a broom in use, and you find the heft comfortable, not too heavy for a long day of sweeping and not so light that it would feel flimsy in the hand. From the shelf above the hearth you take down the hand auger, a tool that consists of a sharp iron bit set into a wooden cross handle, the whole thing no longer than your forearm and polished dark by the grip of your hands over many years. The bit is a simple spoon shape, designed to bore into end grain and remove the wood in small curling chips, and you test its sharpness with your thumb, feeling the keen edge bite slightly against the wool of your skin. Satisfied, you carry the auger and the first hazel handle out into the clearing, where the light is still soft and even under the high cloud, and you set the handle across a low soaring horse that stands near the cottage wall, a simple trestle of two crossed legs supporting a flat top notched in the middle to hold a piece of wood steady. You position the handle so that one end projects a short way beyond the edge of the trestle, and you kneel on the grass beside it, bringing your face close to the end grain of the hazel. The end is smooth from a clean cut, showing the tight rings of the wood's growth, each one a pale circle surrounded by a slightly darker band where the summer wood meets the spring wood. You place the tip of the auger bit in the exact center of the end grain, finding the point by eye and then by touch, your fingertip guiding the iron to the spot where the concentric rings press closest together. The bit settles into the wood with the lightest pressure, and you hold the auger upright, checking the angle by looking across the length of the handle to make sure the hole will run straight and true into the heart of the wood. Now you begin to turn the auger, your right hand gripping the cross handle and your left steadying the shaft, and the bit bites into the hazel with a soft, grinding sound. You turn the tool slowly, not forcing it but letting the sharp iron do its work, and with each half turn a small curl of pale wood rises from the hole and spills onto the grass. The curls are thin as paper and slightly damp, smelling of the linseed oil that has penetrated the outer layers of the wood, and they accumulate in a tiny pile beside your knee, pale against the dark green of the grass. The auger turns with a steady resistance, the wood gripping the bit in a way that tells you the hole is straight and clean, and you pause every few turns to withdraw the bit and clear the shavings from the flutes, tapping the auger lightly against the leg of the trestle to knock the chips free. The hole deepens slowly, the auger boring down into the hazel one fraction of an inch at a time, and you measure the depth by holding a twig alongside the bit and marking the point where the handle should accept the full length of the broom head's bound end. When the mark on the twig lines up with the rim of the hole, you stop turning and withdraw the auger for the last time, setting it aside on the trestle and blowing gently into the hole to clear the last of the dust. The hole is smooth inside, its walls showing the faint spiral tracks of the auger bit, and its diameter is exactly that of the bound end of the broom head, a snug fit that will hold the head firmly without splitting the handle. You fetch the first broom head from the stack by the hearth, carrying it out into the clearing, and holding it up beside the prepared handle. The bound end of the head, compressed by the withies, is now a tight cylinder about the length of your hand and the thickness of a broom handle itself, and you offer it to the hole you have bored, pushing it gently into the opening. The fit is close, requiring a steady pressure to seat the head fully, and you twist the handle slightly as you push, working the bound end deeper until it reaches the bottom of the hole and the flared bristles are snug against the end of the hazel. The connection is firm and void of any wobble, the wood gripping the bound twigs as tightly as the withies grip the twigs themselves. A good joint is the secret of a broom that will last, and although the friction fit is already strong, you will add a second binding to make the union permanent, and to reinforce the handle against the stresses of sweeping. You walk to the trough and select a fresh withy from the ones still soaking there, a long supple rod that you have kept wet for exactly this purpose. The water has kept the willow pliable through the morning, and when you lift it from the trough, it drips a trail of clear drops across the grass. You carry it back to the trestle and prepare it as you prepared the others, splitting the thick end with your thumbnail and twisting it into a cord, feeling the familiar cool slickness of the willow fibers under your fingers. The binding of the handle to the head follows a slightly different pattern from the binding of the twigs alone, because now you are working against the resistance of the hazel and must draw the withy tight enough to hold without crushing the wood. You sit on the low stool that you have brought out from the cottage, placing the broom across your knees with the joint at the center, the head to your left and the handle to your right. You take the twisted end of the withy and pass it around the base of the bristles, just where the birch twigs emerge from the withy bindings of the head, and you make a single turn, pulling the cord snug against the compressed twigs. Then you continue the wrap upward, spiraling along the bound end of the head toward the handle, each turn lying close against the one before, the withy pressing into the slight grooves between the earlier bindings and adding a new layer of strength. When the wrapping reaches the point where the head enters the handle, you change the angle slightly, flaring the turns to cover the joint itself, drawing the withy in a smooth spiral that bridges the gap between the birch and the hazel. The willow cord lies flat and even, each turn parallel to its neighbors, and as you pull it tight, the joint becomes invisible, hidden under a neat sleeve of twisted willow that covers the transition from bound twigs to smooth wood. You work the binding a little way up the handle itself, perhaps the width of 3 fingers, anchoring the head to the hazel so that no amount of sweeping could ever work it loose. Then you make your hitches, the same small locking knots that you used on the broom heads, passing the loose end under the last wrap and pulling it through the loop, drawing each hitch tight and tucking the final end under the wraps so that nothing protrudes. The broom is now whole, a complete object with a head and a handle and a binding that marries the two together, and you hold it up in front of you to judge the alignment. You sight along the length of the handle, closing one eye and looking past the smooth hazel to the fan of birch twigs, checking that the head sits straight and true, that it does not lean to one side or cant at an angle that would make the broom awkward to use. The line is perfect, the head extending from the handle as if the two had grown together in the same wood, and you set the finished broom against the cottage wall with a quiet sense of satisfaction that is too mild to show on your face but settles somewhere deep in your chest. One broom is finished and many remain, so you take the next handle from the stack inside and carry it to the trestle, settling into the rhythm of the work the way you settled into the rhythm of the binding. The auger bites into the end grain again, turning with the same steady pressure, the pale shavings curling up and falling, and the pile of chips beside your knee grows slowly larger. Each hole is bored to the same depth, each fit tested with the same care, and each joint bound with a fresh withy that you prepare in the same way, splitting and twisting and wrapping and hitching until the broom stands complete. The work is repetitive, but not tiring, because the movements are so familiar that they ask for very little energy, only a calm attention that stays with the task at hand. The light in the clearing has shifted slightly while you worked, the high cloud thinning enough that the sun appears as a pale disk behind the veil, casting a diffuse brightness that makes the colors of the grass and the trees seem more vivid without creating harsh shadows. The air continues to carry that mildness that the morning brought, cool enough for comfort, but warm enough that your hands do not stiffen, and the occasional breeze that passes through the birches is gentle enough to stir the leaves without dislodging them. The sounds of the wood have settled into the afternoon rhythm, the wood pigeons calling less often now, and the smaller birds busy with their own quiet occupations. A blackbird rustling in the undergrowth, and a wren scolding softly from a holly bush. You work through the stack of handles one by one, each one slightly different in its exact color and grain, some a little darker where the oil has soaked deeper, others showing a faint ripple in the wood where a branch once grew. The broom heads too vary in their individual character, some with a slightly tighter fan, others with a slightly rounder bound end, and the marriage of each head to its handle requires small adjustments, a little more pressure here, a slightly wider flare of the binding there. Your hands make these adjustments without your having to direct them, the knowledge of the work having passed so deeply into your body that it operates below the level of conscious thought. After the fourth broom is finished and leaning against the wall, you pause to take water again, walking to the well and drawing a fresh bucket, because the earlier one has grown tepid in the afternoon air. The cold water tastes of the deep chalk, a clean mineral flavor that washes the taste of wood dust from your mouth, and you drink slowly, looking out across the clearing at the row of finished brooms that now stands against the cottage wall. Their bristles flare in a neat row of pale silver fans, their handles rise in a line of warm honey-colored wood, and their bindings are darker bands that mark the joints, each one a record of the work that has gone into its making. The sight of them is pleasing, as orderly as the sorted twigs or the withies in their trough. You return to the trestle and continue, and the afternoon deepens by small degrees, the quality of the light sliding from pale gold toward a softer amber and the shadows of the birches stretching farther across the grass. The pile of handles in the cottage corner has dwindled to 3, then 2, then 1, and the pile of wood shavings beside the trestle has grown into a small mound of pale curls that stir very slightly when the breeze passes over them, the lightest chips lifting and settling again. The auger turns with the same steady sound, the withies rap with the same soft creaking, and the brooms are completed in their own time, without haste and without any feeling of urgency. When the last handle has been fitted and bound, and the last broom placed against the wall with its companions, you step back and stretch your arms above your head, feeling the pull in your shoulders and the pleasant ache in your hands that comes from hours of gripping the auger and the withies. The line of finished brooms now numbers 12, a solid body of work that represents 2 days of steady labor and many more days of preparation before that. The gathering and sorting and soaking and binding, all leading to this moment when the brooms stand ready for their final trimming and their journey down to the city. You pick up one of the brooms and hold it in both hands, testing its weight and balance, and you make a few slow sweeping motions in the air, watching the bristles flex and spring back. The broom feels alive in your hands, the hazel handle transmitting the vibration of the birch tips as they move, and you can imagine the sound it will make on a stone floor, a soft shushing that is the voice of clean surfaces and settled dust. You lean the broom gently back against the wall, straightening it so that it lines up with the others, and then you carry the auger and the trestle back into the cottage, wiping the iron bit with an oily rag before hanging the tool on its hook above the hearth. The fire has burned low again while you were outside, and you add a log and wait for the flame to catch, watching the small tongues of fire lick around the bark and begin to take hold. The cottage fills with the smell of burning beech, a clean scent that mingles with the linseed oil and the dry birch and the faint green trace of the willow, withies that still lingers on your hands. Outside, the light continues its slow descent toward evening, and the brooms stand in their row against the wall, waiting for the trimming that will come tomorrow, patient and silent and complete. The morning of the third day arrives with a sky that has cleared entirely, the high cloud of the previous day having moved off to the east during the night and left behind a pale blue expanse that deepens toward the zenith. You step out from the cottage with the wide iron shears in your hand, a tool that has hung on its hook by the hearth since the last time you used it, and which you took down after your breakfast of bread and well water. The shears are heavy, their blades broad and curved like the beak of a hawk, and the iron has been kept free of rust by a thin film of linseed oil that you rubbed into the metal with a rag before coming outside. The handles are wooden grips worn smooth by the same hands that will hold them today, and when you squeeze them together, the blades meet with a soft ringing sound that is the voice of good steel well cared for. The finished brooms lean in their row against the cottage wall. 12 of them now, their hazel handles blowing warmly in the morning sun and their birch bristles flaring in pale fans that catch the light along their silvery edges. You have looked at this row many times since you set the last broom there yesterday evening, each glance a small acknowledgement of the work that has gone into them and the work that remains. Now the trimming will begin, and by the end of the day the brooms will be complete in every particular, ready for the market and the journey and the hands that will use them in kitchens and parlors and stable yards far from this quiet clearing. You carry the shears to the cottage doorstep, where the stone threshold has been worn into a shallow curve by countless feet over countless years, and you sit down with your back against the doorframe and your legs stretched out in front of you. The stone is cool through the fabric of your breeches, and the position is comfortable, giving you a clear view of the clearing while you work. You place the shears beside you on the stone, their blades pointing safely away from your body, and then you rise once more to fetch the first broom from the row. You choose one from the middle of the line, a house broom of medium length and thickness, and you carry it back to the doorstep and lay it across your lap with the bristles extending outward over your left knee and the handle resting along your right thigh. The broom feels solid and balanced in this position, and you take a moment to run your hand over the bristles, feeling the individual tips of the birch twigs spring against your palm. The twigs have dried further overnight, and the fan shape has set in place, the outer curve of the bristles describing a gentle arc that will sweep a broad path across any floor. But the tips are still uneven, some longer than others, some with tiny side shoots that need to be removed, and the trimming will bring them all to a uniform length and a flat, sweeping surface that will wear evenly over months of use. You pick up the shears and open them wide, the two blades parting with a smooth motion that reveals the honed inner edges, and you position them at the far left edge of the bristle fan. The first cut is always a small one, a test to feel how the shears bite into the birch and how the twigs respond to the cutting. You close the handles together, and the blades meet in a single clean snick that severs a few of the longest tips and lets them fall onto the stone beside your foot. The sound is crisp and final, a small punctuation mark in the quiet of the morning, and the cut ends of the bristles show pale circles of inner wood that contrast with the silvery bark. You open the shears again and move them a little to the right, aligning the blades with the uncut bristles beside the ones you have already trimmed, and you make a second cut, then a third and a fourth, working your way across the fan from left to right in a series of small, precise snips that each remove only a fraction of an inch of wood. The shears are sharp enough that the cutting requires very little force, only a gentle squeeze of your fingers, and the rhythm of the work settles quickly into a pattern. Position the blades, close the handles, open the handles, shift to the right, repeat. The snipping sound is soft and regular, and between the snips you hear the other sounds of the morning, the robin singing from its hawthorn, and the distant bleat of a sheep on the hillside, and the light breeze moving through the birch leaves overhead. The trimmed tips fall in a fine shower around your feet, pale slivers of birch wood and tiny fragments of bark that catch the sunlight as they drop and then lie still on the stone, forming a scatter of pale debris that grows very slowly as you work. Some of the trimmings are as thin as a needle, the very ends of the finest twigs, and others are slightly thicker, the result of evening out a twig that was longer than its neighbors. The cut ends of the bristles are now forming a flat surface, a uniform plane that will meet the floor squarely and sweep the dust into a neat pile without leaving any stray lines or skips. When you have worked your way across the full width of the fan, you lower the shears to your lap and run your palm over the cut ends, checking the evenness of the surface. Your hand detects a slight ridge near the center, a place where 2 or 3 twigs are still a little longer than the rest, and you lift the shears again and make a few more small snips to bring them level. Then you turn the broom over and inspect the back of the fan, where a few tiny side shoots have sprouted from some of the twigs, thin as hairs, and easily missed during the salting. You trim these away with the tips of the shears, making delicate cuts close to the bark, and the side shoots fall away cleanly, leaving the bristles smooth and uniform. The first broom is now fully trimmed, and you stand it upright on the stone between your feet, checking the alignment one last time. The bristles are flat across the bottom, the fan is even in its spread, and the handle rises straight and true from the bound head. You lean the finished broom carefully against the wall, apart from the untrimmed ones, beginning a new row that will grow through the morning and the afternoon. Then you reach for the next broom from the original row and settle it across your lap, the same position as before, and begin the process again. The work of trimming is the quietest of all the tasks in the broom squire's trade, because it asks for the least physical effort and the most steady attention. There is no hefting of water buckets or pressing of bundles against a crossbar, only the light grip of the shears and the small repetitive motion of opening and closing your hand. The challenge, if it can be called a challenge, is to maintain an even line across the bristles without cutting too deep or leaving the surface ragged. And this requires a kind of relaxed concentration that you have cultivated over many years. Your eyes guide the shears, your fingers control the pressure, and your mind stays with the work without wandering far, anchored by the soft snipping and the sunlight and the familiar weight of the broom on your knees. The robin comes again, as it has come every day that you have worked outside, and this time it lands on the doorstep itself, a few feet from your hip, its head turned to watch the shears with a bright, curious eye. You glance at the bird without pausing your work, and the robin stays for a count of 10 or 12, then flies off toward the well, where it perches on the bucket and preens a wing feather with quick small movements of its beak. The wood pigeons are calling in the birches, their notes slow and drowsy as always, and somewhere high above the clearing a buzzard is circling on a thermal, its wings spread wide and motionless, a tiny cross shape against the pale blue of the sky. As you trim the second broom and then the third, you become aware of the scent that the cutting releases, a green smell that rises from the cut ends of the birch twigs and mixes with the dry warm smell of the stone doorstep and the faint smoke from the cottage chimney. It is the smell of sap, though the sap is rising only slowly at this time of year, and it has a freshness to it that is not sharp or pungent, but clean and slightly sweet, the smell of the birch woods condensed into a single note. The scent hangs in the air around the doorstep and is renewed with each snip of the shears, a constant presence that marks the hours of the trimming. You pause now and then to flex your fingers, which can grow slightly stiff from the repeated motion of the shears, and to look out across the clearing at the day's progress. The sun climbs higher, and the shadows of the birches shorten, drawing back toward the trunks that cast them, and the grass of the clearing dries fully in the warmth, the last traces of the morning dew evaporating into the air. A few small white butterflies are dancing over the wild flowers by the well, their flight a random fluttering that seems to follow no purpose, and the buzzard has drifted farther east on its thermal, now only a speck among the thin cirrus clouds that are beginning to form high up near the zenith. The row of untrimmed brooms slowly shortens, and the row of trimmed brooms slowly lengthens, the two lines moving in opposite directions like the hands of a clock. You work through the morning without any sense of fatigue, your hands accustomed to the task and your mind content to follow the rhythm, and by the time the sun is directly overhead, the trimming is half done, and the doorstep is covered with a fine layer of birch trimmings that crinkle under your boots when you stand up to take a rest. You step over the scatter of cuttings and walk out into the clearing, carrying the shears with you to wipe the blades with a rag that hangs from your belt. The iron is warm from the sun and from the friction of cutting, and you oil it lightly before setting the shears down on the top of the well cover while you draw water for a drink. The dipper is cool in your hand, and you drink slowly, looking back at the cottage where the brooms stand in their two rows, the untrimmed ones waiting patiently, and the trimmed ones neat and complete, their bristle ends now an even pale color that catches the light as a single flat surface. The afternoon that follows is much the same as the morning, the same sitting on the doorstep, and the same soft snipping of the shears, and the same slow accumulation of trimmings on the stone. You trim the remaining brooms one after another, and each one is a small variation on the same theme, a slightly different width of fan or a slightly different thickness of bristle that requires a slight adjustment in the angle of the shears. The work is monotonous in the best sense of the word, a single, steady note that plays on without interruption, and the hours pass without your noticing them, carried away on the gentle current of the task. When the last broom is trimmed and set into the finished row, you lay the shears across your knees and sit still for a moment, looking at the 13 brooms that are now complete. The row is straight and orderly, each broom identical to its neighbors in its essential form, but each one subtly unique in the pattern of its bark and the exact shade of its hazel handle. The bristles are all flat and even, ready to sweep any floor from the cobbles of a London market to the boards of a country kitchen, and the bindings are all tight and neat, the withies now fully dry and set in their permanent shape. You rise from the doorstep and sweep the trimmings into a pile with the side of your boot, then scoop them into a small basket that you keep for kindling, because the dry birch fragments will catch a flame as readily as any straw and will help to start the morning fire on a cold day. You carry the basket inside and set it by the hearth, then return to the clearing and gather the finished brooms 2 at a time, carrying them into the cottage and leaning them against the wall near the door, where they will be easy to load onto the cart when the time comes. The cottage is dim after the brightness of the clearing, and the brooms make a soft rustling sound as you set them in place, the bristles brushing against one another and against the flint wall. You arrange them carefully so that none of the fans are bent or crushed, and when they are all inside, you step back and look at them, the fruit of 3 days of steady, unhurried work. The trimming is finished, the brooms are whole, and the only thing that remains is to take them down to the city and sell them, which you will do tomorrow or the day after, depending on the weather and the state of the track. But for now, the afternoon is beginning to deepen toward evening, the light turning amber and the shadows stretching long across the clearing, and you sit down on the doorstep to rest, your hands still and the shears cleaned and hung back on their hook, the quiet of the hills settling around you like the close of a long, calm, ordinary day. The morning you have chosen for the journey arrives without any particular announcement, a day that looks at first much like the days that came before it, with a pale sky and a light dew on the grass and the wood pigeons calling softly from the birches. But there is a difference in the air, a sense of completion that has settled over the clearing now that the brooms stand ready against the cottage wall, and the binding frame has been put away and the trough of withies has been emptied and cleaned. You rise from your bed of straw a little earlier than usual, while the stars still show faintly through the small window, and you eat the last of the bread and drink a cup of water before stepping outside into the cool dimness that precedes the dawn. The cart waits under the lean-to on the north side of the cottage, a simple 2-wheeled vehicle that you built yourself many years ago from seasoned oak and ash. Its bed is a flat platform of elm boards, about the length of a tall man and the width of your outstretched arms, and its sides are low rails that keep the load from sliding off without making it difficult to stack. The wheels are solid discs of elm, each one made from 3 planks pegged together and bound with an iron tire that has worn smooth and shiny along its outer edge. The axle is a single shaft of ash, greased with tallow, and the cart handles are 2 long poles that extend forward from the axle and are cross-braced near the grip. You take hold of these handles now and pull the cart out from under the lean-to, the wheels turning with a soft creak that sounds loud in the early stillness, the tallow on the axle giving off a faint animal smell that mingles with the damp grass. You position the cart in the center of the clearing, facing the track that leads out of the woods and down the hill, and you chock the wheels with a pair of flat stones so that the cart will not roll while you load it. Then you walk back to the cottage and begin to carry the brooms out, 2 at a time, laying them on the grass beside the cart in a neat row. The brooms are 20 in number, the entire product of the week's work, and each one has been trimmed and inspected and found satisfactory. Their hazel handles glow with a soft honey color in the growing light, and their birch bristles fan out in pale arcs that rustle against each other as you move them, a sound like the wind in dry reeds. Before any broom is placed on the cart, you bring out the old sacking that you keep for packing, a collection of worn grain sacks and scraps of canvas that have been washed and folded and stored in the cottage corner. You spread several of the larger sacks across the bed of the cart, arranging them so that they overlap and form a padded layer that will cushion the brooms against the bumps of the track. The sacking is coarse and greyish-brown, smelling faintly of flour and dust, and the fibres are soft under your fingers from years of use. You smooth the cloth flat, pressing out the wrinkles and tucking the edges under the side rails so that nothing will flap loose during the journey. The brooms must be loaded with care because the birch heads are strong, but they can be crushed if too much weight is laid upon them, and a crushed broom head will sweep poorly and may crack after a few weeks of use. You pick up the first broom and lay it on the padded bed, with the bristles pointing toward the front of the cart and the handle extending toward the back, a position that will protect the bristles from being compressed by the other brooms that will come on top. You arrange the head so that the fan of bristles lies flat against the sacking, and you press it down gently, feeling the spring of the twigs give slightly under your hand. Then you take a length of soft twine from the coil in your pocket and tie the handle loosely to the side rail, not tightly enough to dig into the wood, but firmly enough to prevent the broom from shifting. The second broom goes beside the first, its bristles aligned in the same direction, and you tie it in the same way. You build the first layer in this manner, laying 7 brooms side by side with their heads all pointing forward, each one separated from its neighbors by a thin strip of folded sacking that you insert between the handles to prevent them from rubbing together and wearing away the linseed finish. The layer is full when the brooms cover the width of the cart bed, and you stand back to check that the load is even before beginning the second layer. The second layer is laid with the brooms pointing in the opposite direction, their heads toward the back of the cart and their handles toward the front, so that the thick bound ends of the first layer and the thick bound ends of the second layer do not press directly on the finer bristles below. This alternating arrangement has been worked out over many journeys, and you follow it without having to think, your hands building the load the way a mason builds a wall, placing each piece with an eye to the balance of the whole. You slip more strips of sacking between the layers, and you tie each broom individually to the side rails, the twine making small knots that are easy to undo when the time comes to unload. The load rises slowly, a third layer added with the brooms pointing forward again, then a fourth the same as the second, until all 20 brooms are on the cart and the stack reaches almost to the height of your chest. The cart has taken on a different look now, no longer an empty vehicle but a laden one, its bed hidden under the pale fans of the birch heads and the warm honey of the hazel handles. The whole pile tidy and secure and smelling of dry wood and linseed oil and old sacking. You walk around the cart once, checking each tire and pushing gently against the load to test its stability, and nothing shifts or wobbles, the brooms held fast by the twine and the careful arrangement of the layers. The final step in the loading is to cover the entire stack with a large piece of canvas that you have kept for this purpose, a weathered sheet that was once part of a wagon tilt and still has a few rust stains where iron nails once passed through. You drape the canvas over the load, letting it fall down the sides of the cart, and you tuck the edges under the sacks that line the bed, pulling the fabric tight so that it will not balloon in the wind. The canvas will keep the brooms clean from dust and road grit, and it will also protect them from any light rain that might come during the journey. You secure the canvas with a length of coarse rope, passing it over the top of the load and cinching it down to the side rails, pulling each knot firm, but leaving the ends loose enough that you can undo them easily when you reach the market. The cart is now fully loaded, and you take a moment to walk around it one more time, checking the wheels and the axle and the handles, making sure that nothing has been forgotten. The tallow on the axle is fresh and smooth. The iron tires are sound. The grip of the handles is worn to fit your hands exactly. You remove the chocks from the wheels and set them aside at the base of the lean-to, where they will wait for your return. Then you go back into the cottage to collect the few things you will need for the road: a small linen bag containing a piece of hard cheese and a heel of bread, a leather bottle filled with water from the well, and a woolen cloak in case the evening turns cool. You bank the fire so that it will smolder safely while you are away, and you close the cottage door, though you do not lock it, because there is no lock and no need for one. The track that leads out of the clearing and down through the woods is a familiar one, and you take your place between the handles of the cart and begin to walk. The cart follows behind you, the wheels turning on their axle, with a low grinding sound as the iron tires meet the stones that are scattered along the track, a sound that is not unpleasant but steady and rhythmic, the heartbeat of the journey. The weight of the loaded cart is not great. 20 brooms and some sacking and a canvas cover adding up to less than the weight of a full-grown man, but you can feel the drag on the handles, a mild resistance that asks you to lean forward slightly as you walk. The track winds through the birch woods for the first part of the journey, the same trees that you have walked among every day, now passing on either side as you move slowly forward. The morning light filters through the canopy in long slanted rays, lighting patches of the track ahead, and then leaving them in shade as the sun climbs and the angle changes. The birds are singing their morning chorus, a sound that you have heard so often that it has become a kind of silence, a background that you notice only when it stops. A few fallen twigs crinkle under the cart wheels, snapping with a small, sharp sound, and the canvas cover rustles very slightly as the cart bumps over the uneven ground. After perhaps half a mile, the woods begin to thin, the birches giving way to mixed hedgerow and then to open fields that slope downward toward the valley floor. The track becomes wider here, joining with other paths that run from other cottages and farms, and the surface changes from soft earth and moss to a harder layer of packed chalk that has been compacted by the hooves of sheep and the wheels of other carts over many seasons. The chalk is pale and dusty, and the cart wheels leave shallow tracks behind them as you walk, two parallel lines that will be erased by the next rain, but which mark your passage for now. The grinding sound of the wheels on chalk is slightly different from the sound on stones, a softer hissing that blends with the rustle of the hedgerow leaves. The hedgerows on either side of the track are dense and old, made up of hawthorn and elder and dogwood, and the occasional wild rose whose hips are beginning to turn red with the arrival of autumn. Among the hedgerow trees stand occasional oaks, their trunks gnarled and thick, their leaves still green, but with a faint brown edge that speaks of the coming cold. The acorns are dropping now, and you hear one fall onto the cart canvas with a soft thump, then roll off onto the track. A grey squirrel runs along a low branch and freezes, watching you pass, its tail twitching once before it continues on its way. The landscape opens further as you descend, the track curving around the shoulder of the hill and revealing the wider valley that you have seen from the edge of the clearing, but which now surrounds you, its fields and woods and distant ridges spreading out on all sides like a map unrolled. The fields are mostly stubble now, the harvested barley and wheat leaving behind short pale stalks that gleam in the morning sun, and here and there a field of root crops shows a darker green, turnips or mandelwurzels still in the ground. The sheep that graze on the pastures are scattered in small white groups, each one cropping the grass with a steady rhythm that matches the rhythm of your walking, and the lambs born in spring are now almost as large as their mothers. The track meets the turnpike road at the bottom of the hill, a broader way that runs from the market towns of the west to the edge of London in the east, and you turn onto it with the cart following smoothly behind. The surface here is better maintained, a layer of gravel laid over the chalk and rolled flat, and the wheels hum against it with a sound that is lower and more continuous than the grinding of the woodland track. The road is quiet at this hour, the main traffic of carriers and coaches having passed earlier or not yet arriving, and you walk along the left-hand side with the cart, keeping to the edge where the gravel is loose and the walking is easiest. The landscape along the turnpike is a mixture of farms and small hamlets and occasional stretches of common land where the gorse grows thick, and the air smells of its coconut-like blossom. You pass a cottage very like your own, its thatch dark with age, its chimney sending up a thin line of smoke, and a dog barks once from the doorway before settling back onto its patch of sun-warmed earth. Farther on, a man is mending a hedge with a billhook, his strokes slow and regular, and he raises one hand in greeting as you pass, a gesture that you return with a slight nod. No words are exchanged, because none are needed. The miles pass in a steady sequence, the cartwheels turning and turning, the handles pressing into your palms with a familiar weight. You stop once to drink from the leather bottle, the water still cool from the well, and you eat a piece of bread and cheese while you stand on the grassy verge, listening to the larks singing high overhead and the distant crow of a cockerel from a farm somewhere out of sight. The cart rests beside you, the canvas cover moving very slightly in the breeze, and a few small flies settle on the wooden handles before departing again. The afternoon brings a change in the landscape as you draw closer to the city. The fields become smaller and more intensively cultivated, the hedgerows thinner and more regularly laid, and the road begins to carry more traffic. A herd of cows is being driven toward a dairy, their hooves making a soft thudding on the gravel, and you step aside to let them pass, the cart tilting very slightly as you pull it onto the verge. A carrier's wagon overtakes you later, its driver calling out a good day, and the dust raised by its iron-shod wheels hangs in the air for some minutes before settling. The sounds of the countryside, the bird song and the breeze and the bleating of sheep, are gradually joined by other sounds, the distant barking of more dogs, and the ring of a blacksmith's hammer from a village forge, and, far off and barely perceptible, a low, constant hum that is the voice of London itself. You walk on, the cart bumping gently over the now more travelled road, the brooms secure onto their canvas, and the light begins to shift from the amber of afternoon toward the softer tones of evening. The hills have receded behind you, and the land is flatter now, the sky opening wider, and ahead in the distance you can begin to see the first real signs of the city, a church spire rising above a line of trees and the dark smudge of smoke that hangs over the rooftops of the outer parishes. The cart creaks softly as it rolls, and you walk beside it with the steady pace that has carried you all day, your mind quiet and your body tired in the pleasant way that comes from a long journey under a mild sky, the brooms ready for the market that will open with the next dawn. The last stars fade while you are still walking, their faint silver points absorbed one by one into a sky that has begun to lighten over the eastern rooftops, turning from black to deep grey to a pale wash of yellow that touches the highest chimneys and the spires of the churches that rise above the crowded streets. You have been on the road for most of the night, pausing only once to rest the cart under a sheltered hedge and to eat the last of your bread, and now the track has become a proper paved way that runs between low brick walls and passing houses whose windows are still dark. The sound of the cart wheels changes on the paving, a sharper clatter that echoes off the walls of the narrower lanes, and you guide the handles carefully to keep the load from jostling. The outskirts of London come to meet you gradually, not as a sudden arrival, but as a slow accumulation of signs and sounds and smells. First there are more houses, then more, their upper stories overhanging the lane so that you pass through a tunnel of timber and plaster and dark brick. Then there are the smells, wood smoke from many chimneys, the yeasty scent of a bakehouse already at work, the faint sharpness of tanning pits from somewhere beyond the next turning, and under it all, the cool wet smell of the river that curves through the city and sends its damp breath up into the streets. You hear a watchman call the hour from some distant square, his voice carrying flat and clear in the stillness, and then the first carts of other early travellers begin to appear, their wheels grinding on the paving, their drivers hunched in cloaks against the morning chill. You do not hurry. The market at Cheapside will not begin until after dawn, and the stall holders will still be setting out their wares even then, so there is no need to rush the cart through the dark streets. You walk at the same steady pace that has brought you all the way from the hills, the handles of the cart pressing into your palms with a familiarity that has become part of your body over the miles, and you follow the lane as it widens into a broader street lined with shops whose shutters are still closed. A signboard creaks overhead, its painted letters too dim to read, and a cat slips across the cobbles in front of you, pausing once to look back with eyes that flash green in the faint light before it vanishes into an alley. The street opens into a square where a public fountain plays, the water falling into a stone basin with a sound that is shockingly clear after the muffled quiet of the lanes, and you stop here to rest the cart and drink from your leather bottle. The square is empty except for a few early figures, a woman drawing water from the fountain and a man pushing a barrow loaded with cabbages, and the buildings that surround it are tall and close-set, their upper windows still curtained against the night. You lean against the cart handles and listen to the sound of the city waking, a low murmur that rises and falls, the creak of axles and the call of a cockerel and the distant clang of a smithy's first hammer ringing on iron. When the sky above the square has lightened enough that the edges of the buildings are sharp against it, you take up the handles again and continue on. The streets grow busier as you approach the market, the pavements now crowded with carts and hand-barrows and people on foot, all moving toward the same center. A drover passes with a small flock of sheep, their woolly backs pressing together and their hooves clicking on the cobbles, and you pull the cart to the side to let them go by, the sheep smelling of lanolin and meadow grass. A baker's boy runs past with a tray of loaves balanced on his head, and a group of porters stand outside a warehouse, their ropes and hooks hanging from their belts, their voices low and rough with sleep. The market square near Cheapside opens before you as you round the last corner, and even at this early hour it is alive with movement and noise. The square is a broad expanse of cobbles, surrounded on three sides by tall houses with shops at their street level, and on the fourth side by the bulk of a church whose tower catches the first direct light of the rising sun. The centre of the square is filled with stalls, some permanent timber structures with tilted roofs of canvas and others temporary arrangements of trestles and boards that the sellers are still hammering into place. The air is thick with the smells of the market, a mingling of fresh bread and aging cheese and green vegetables and live poultry and the ever-present undernote of horse dung and straw. You find your spot at the edge of the square, a place that you have used on many previous visits, a narrow gap between a stall selling wooden spoons and bowls and another that offers baskets woven from osiers. The spot is not marked or reserved, but the other sellers know you and nod as you pull the cart into place, their hands busy with their own arrangements. You chock the wheels with the same flat stones you used at the cottage, though here the stones are cobbles borrowed from the edge of the gutter, and then you begin to unload the brooms. The canvas cover comes off first, folded and stowed under the cart, and then you untie the twine that holds the brooms to the side rails, working from the top layer downward. You lift each broom carefully, checking that the bristles have not been bent or crushed during the journey, and you find them all sound and straight, the canvas having protected them from the dust and the occasional bump. You stack the brooms on the cobbles beside the cart, leaning them upright against the side rail in a fan that shows off the silvery birch heads and the warm hazel handles, an arrangement that you know from experience catches the eye of the passing buyers. When all 20 brooms are unloaded and displayed, you position the cart out of the way against the wall of the churchyard, and you take your place beside the brooms, standing with your hands loosely clasped in front of you. The other sellers are all around you now, a low murmur of voices that rises as the square fills with the first shoppers of the morning. The spoon seller arranges his wares in neat rows on a velvet cloth, the pale wood gleaming. The basket seller hangs his osiers from hooks on the front of his stall, the withies the same colour as the ones you used to bind your brooms. A woman at the stall opposite sells herbs tied in paper bundles, and the scent of lavender and rosemary drifts across the cobbles every time she rearranges her stock. The buyers begin to appear in numbers now, and the square takes on the rhythm of trade, a steady flow of people moving from stall to stall, examining goods, asking prices, handing over coins. They are mostly women at this hour, maids and housekeepers and the wives of shopkeepers, their baskets already beginning to fill with the day's provisions. Some are dressed in the plain woolen clothes of the middling sort, and others in the rougher fabrics of the poor, and a few wear the white aprons and caps of servants from the larger houses in the streets around the square. Their voices rise and fall in the familiar patterns of bargaining, the asking, and the counter, and the agreement, and the coins clink in the wooden trays of the sellers and are dropped into leather pouches and deep pockets. The first buyer to stop at your spot is a young woman in a clean white cap, a maid from one of the tall houses, who picks up a broom and tests its weight, running her hand over the bristles and checking the straightness of the handle. You watch her without speaking, letting the broom speak for itself, and after a moment she nods and asks the price. You name a figure, neither high nor low, a fair price that you have arrived at over many market days and many hundreds of brooms. And she reaches into the purse at her belt and counts out the coins, dropping them into your palm one by one. The coins are small and worn, the copper smooth from long circulation, and you close your fingers around them and slide them into the leather pouch inside your coat. The maid takes a broom and goes, and the first sale of the morning is done. The second buyer is a shopkeeper who comes every month or so, and who recognizes you from previous visits. He nods in greeting, and selects 2 brooms, one for the shop floor and one for the back room, and he pays without haggling, knowing from experience that the price is fair and the brooms are sound. You help him tie the brooms together with a length of twine so that he can carry them over his shoulder, and he goes off into the crowd with the pale bristles bobbing above his head, like a strange headdress. The sales continue in this quiet rhythm as the morning advances, each transaction small and unhurried, a brief exchange of words and coins, and then the broom passes into the hands of its new owner and disappears into the crowd. A dairy woman buys a sturdy yard broom, testing the stiffness of the bristles by pressing them against the cobbles. An elderly man in the black coat of a clerk buys a hearth broom, his fingers thin and careful as he examines the bindings. A young couple buy 3 brooms together, newly married and setting up house, and they argue gently about which handle is the straightest before laughing and taking the ones you selected for them. The coins accumulate in your purse, a small weight that grows gradually heavier throughout the morning. The sun climbs higher above the church tower, and the light in the square changes from the pale gold of dawn to the clearer white of full morning. The crowds thicken and then thin again as the early shoppers finish their purchases and go home, and a second wave of buyers arrives, these ones more leisurely, stopping to talk with the sellers and to examine goods at length. The noise of the market is a constant background now, so constant that you cease to notice it. The cries of the sellers calling their wares, and the laughter of children, and the barking of a dog, and the rumble of cartwheels on the cobbles, all blending into one sound, that is the sound of the city living its life. By mid-morning your stack of brooms has shrunk to fewer than half a dozen, and you rearrange them against the cart rail so that they still look full and inviting. The last few sales are often the slowest, the early rush having passed, and the remaining buyers being those who come late or who have no urgent need, and you stand patiently by your cart, watching the square and the people and the slow movement of the shadows across the cobbles as the sun continues its ascent. A housekeeper in a wide grey dress buys 2 of the remaining brooms, complaining mildly about the dust that collects on the back stairs of her employer's house, and you nod sympathetically and hand her the brooms and take her coins. A young boy buys a small hearth broom with pennies that he has clearly saved, his face serious and proud, and you choose the straightest one in the remaining pile and hand it down to him, watching him walk away with the broom held carefully in both hands as if it were a scepter. The last broom sells just before the bells of the church ring out the hour of 11. A simple house broom, taken by a woman who says she has worn her old one down to a stub and has been meaning to replace it for weeks. She pays the same coins that all the others have paid, and you place the broom in her basket, and she threads her way back through the crowd and is gone. The cart rail is empty now, the cobbles bare except for a few loose birch trimmings that have fallen from the bristles during the morning, and you sweep them into the gutter with the side of your boot, watching them scatter and settle in the cracks between the stones. The market is still busy, and will be for hours yet, but your part in it is done. You walk to the cart and check the wheels and the axle, finding everything in order, and you take a last drink from the leather bottle before stowing it under the seat. The coins in your purse are a comfortable weight, enough to buy flour and salt and a length of good hemp rope and a few other small necessities that you will pick up from the shops on your way out of the city, but not so much that you feel weighted down, a fair return for a week of honest work. You guide the empty cart out of the square, the handles light in your hands now that there is no load to pull, and you turn onto the road that leads westward, the same road that brought you here in the darkness of the early morning. The city streets are brighter now and fuller, the shutters of the shops all open and the shopkeepers standing in their doorways, and you walk through the bustle without any sense of hurry, letting the cart rattle lightly over the cobbles. The sounds of London fade very slowly, the cries of the market and the rumble of wagons dwindling to a distant murmur, and then fading altogether as you reach the outskirts and the lanes open into the countryside beyond. The sun is high and warm on your shoulders, the sky a clear pale blue, with a few small clouds that drift very slowly from west to east, and the road ahead is the same road you followed yesterday, the same gravel and chalk, and the same hedgerows, heavy with hawthorn berries, and the same fields of pale stubble. You walk at an even pace, the empty cart following with a light clatter, and the miles pass under your feet without any particular effort, the rhythm of the walking having become as natural as breathing. The hills rise in the distance, the same green ridges that you've known your whole life, and you watch them grow slowly larger as the afternoon deepens and the light begins its slow slide toward evening. You will reach the cottage sometime after dark, the stars showing clearly over the birches, the fire waiting to be rekindled, and the bed of straw waiting for your rest. The brooms are gone now, scattered across the city in kitchens and parlors and stable yards, each one doing its quiet work in places you will never see. But the work will begin again tomorrow or the next day, the withies soaking in the trough and the twigs waiting in the hollow and the binding frame standing ready against the wall, and the same hands that have done all this before will do it all again, in the same slow rhythm and with the same steady patience that the work has always asked for. The cart rattles on the stones, the hills rise before you, and the road home unwinds under the fading afternoon sky, calm and quiet and without end.